At its peak, the Medellín Cartel was pulling in more money than some countries. This was a multi-billion-dollar empire fueled by cocaine, corruption, and sheer terror. They didn't just control a city, they controlled an entire nation from the shadows. But power has a price, and the cartel's story would end in bloodshed. This is a tale of obscene wealth, unchecked power, and a war that spiraled out of control. And like all great stories, it begins with a very ambitious man. They called him Pablo Escobar. And he was as close to the devil as a man could be. Pablo Escobar was born in 1949 in Rio Negro de Colombia, and he grew up in Medellin. From a young age, he had one obsession: money. His first ventures were small time, stealing tombstones and reselling them, followed by car theft. But these petty crimes weren't enough for him. He had bigger dreams, and he was determined to make them a reality. A few decades later, he would become one of the most feared men in history, all because of one deadly product: cocaine. Before the 1970s, cocaine was a forgotten drug, a relic of the past, overshadowed by heroin and marijuana. But in the glittering nightclubs of Miami and New York, a new appetite was growing. American demand for cocaine was about to explode. Meanwhile, in the hills of Medellín, Colombia, a group of ambitious criminals saw an opportunity. They were not the first to sell cocaine, and they were not the biggest at the time, but they had something others didn't: a massive vision. While everybody else saw a product, Pablo Escobar and his associates, they saw an empire. These guys were not just building a drug operation. They were creating the world's most powerful criminal corporation, and their rise was nothing short of revolutionary. They set up the first large-scale cocaine manufacturing labs deep in the Colombian jungle. But their real innovation wasn't in production, it was in distribution. Using a small aircraft and creative smuggling routes, they transformed cocaine trafficking into an industrial scaled operation. By the early 1980s, they were shipping up to 2,500 kilos of cocaine per flight into the United States. The profits were staggering. At their peak, they were earning $420 million per week. Pablo Escobar had so much cash that he literally stored it in the warehouses and lost millions to rats eating it. His accountants couldn't count the money fast enough and spent $2,500 monthly on rubber bands just to wrap the cash. I met somebody called El Chino Millán, and he alleged that he was working with Pablo Escobar back in the day, and he told me instead of counting the money, they used to weigh it. That's how much money they had. At its height, the cartel controlled 80% of the global cocaine market. This wasn't just a criminal enterprise, it was a parallel economy. But such a massive operations requires both brains and brawn. That's why the cartel had key figures like the Ochoa brothers, paramilitary Jose Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, and Pablo Escobar's cousin, Gustavo Gaviria. These men called the shots for Medellin's most feared hitmen, the sicarios. They decided who lived and who died, but that power would eventually lead them to face some truly dire consequences. You see, as the cartel flourished, they actually built legitimate businesses across Colombia, constructed hospitals and housing for the poor, and even created a zoo with exotic animals. They essentially created a state within a state, with their own army, political sway, and social programs. But how did Pablo Escobar reach his level of power? It wasn't just money or violence. He had a strategy. He called it plata o plomo, silver or lead. Either you took his bribe or you took a bullet. This method allowed him to control police, judges, and even an entire town. He even offered to pay off Colombians' entire national debt in exchange for amnesty. And that offer, of course, was rejected. His influence was so deep that many saw him as a Robin Hood figure, helping the poor while terrorizing the rich. However, His war against the state made him too dangerous. For Pablo Escobar, money was never enough. He craved power, and in Colombia that meant politics. But this would ultimately prove his biggest mistake. In 1982, Escobar actually got elected to Congress. The idea? Make himself untouchable. But the establishment wasn't having it. When Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla exposed Escobar's drug empire, he was assassinated. And that was just the beginning. The government struck back, and suddenly Escobar wasn't a politician. He was the most wanted man in Colombia. But that didn't make him back down. If he couldn't buy the country, he'll simply take it. And that's what he did. What followed was absolute chaos. Bombings, murders, and assassinations. Escobar declared war on the state. The cartel killed judges, police officers, politicians, anyone who stood their way. But they crossed a line when they killed one of the country's most important figures. That act would ultimately lead to the downfall of the Medellín Cartel. You see, on August 18, 1989, in Soacha, Colombia, presidential candidate Luis Carlos Galán, a vocal enemy of the cartel, took the stage at a campaign rally. And little did he know, Escobar's sicarios were waiting for him. Suddenly, bullets flew, wounding several people and killing the candidate. For the first time, the poor saw Escobar for who he really was. He marked one of the bloodiest chapters in Colombia history. Yet, that wasn't the end of it. After killing Luis Carlos Galán, they went after his successor, Cesar Gaviria. They bombed Avianca Flight 203 in an attempt to eliminate the next presidential candidate because of his stance on extraditing Colombian drug lords to the United States. By some miracle, Gaviria changed his travel plans at the last minute, but the bombing claimed the lives of 110 people. This incident helped Gaviria win the 1990 election in a landslide, marking the beginning of the fall of the Medellín Cartel. The United States government got involved, sending the DEA, CIA, and military aid. Colombia formed an elite task force, making Escobar the world's most haunted man. The new president launched a systematic campaign against Escobar's organization. On December 15th, 1989, they killed José Rodríguez Gacha in a police operation. A few months later, Escobar's cousin, Gustavo Gaviria, he was gunned down in a shootout. Even the Ochoa brothers were forced into hiding. The empire was crumbling, but Escobar has still one last trick up his sleeve. In 1991, he made the government a deal. He would surrender in exchange for a custom-built prison, one he designed himself. La Catedral was far from a typical prison. It was more like a five-star resort. From there, he continued running his empire with nightclubs, soccer fields, and lavish parties as if nothing had happened. However, his next mistake would cost him everything. In 1992, while he was still in this prison that he designed himself, Escobar killed two of his associates, a move that would ultimately lead to his death. The government wanted to move him to a real prison, but it was too late. He simply walked out of the prison, becoming a fugitive once again. But this time, he wouldn't be so lucky. The Colombian government, the US, and a vigilante group called Los Pepes, made up of all his enemies, they hunted him down. Many members of Los Pepes were actually former associates or allies of Escobar in the cocaine trade who had been betrayed, backstabbed, or harmed by him. With so many enemies, the Medellín Cartel crumbled in no time. His men were either killed or turned against him. The US and Colombian forces used advanced surveillance, informants, and military operations to dismantle Escobar's empire. The man who had once been a kingpin with a network across continents was now a fugitive. The luxury and grandeur of his former life, his lavish mansions, personal zoo, and private army, they were gone. The Medellín Cartel, which once controlled the flow of cocaine into the United States, was reduced to a mere shadow of its former self. His once mighty network was now a crumbling house of cards, ready to fall at any moment. The enemies he had made over the years, rival cartels, law enforcement, and even former allies were all closing in. He was no longer the king, he was a cornered animal. During one of his many fugitive moments, he famously burnt $2 million in cash just to keep his daughter warm while they were hiding out in a remote location. At this point, the money was nothing to him, just another representation of how far he had fallen. His wealth, once limitless, was now useless in the face of the chaos he had created. By the end, Escobar was hiding in a small house in Medellin, constantly on the run, paranoid and exhausted. His final phone call to his son led to his location being traced. On December 2nd, 1993, Pablo Escobar was found in Medellin. The police tracked his phone calls. He even tried to run across the rooftops, but was gunned down to death. And with Escobar dead, the Medellin Cartel was over. But that didn't mean the drug trade stopped. The power shifted to the Cali Cartel and later to Mexico. The violence never truly ended. New players took control and methods evolved, but the game stayed the same. Profit over lives, greed over peace. The names change, but the story repeats itself over and over again.